pretend a little bit that maybe you're retired. Anyway, I'm kidding. But both talks so far have been amazing, fantastic. So last but not least, we have Robert. There you go.
Well, those are two tough acts to follow, but actually one of the things that I like to do in going back is really kind of touching on parts of both presentations that I think really mean a lot to what I do. I'm an education attorney and a motivational speaker, and starting off with Dr. Resnick's talking about testing, I will say my opinion as an education attorney and an advocate is that it is crucial. Testing is really everything. I recall a number of years ago talking to a bunch of different clinicians, and the psychiatrist saying that a detailed clinical history really diagnoses ADHD appropriately, versus a neuropsychologist might say neuropsych testing. I have to say, from an education perspective, going in and asking for services for a student with a disability, especially ADHD, the subtests and all of the different testing, really a thorough analysis is really a blueprint for what I'm going to be advocating for, what I'm going to be asking the school for, and why. Because the testing bears it out. You can see this child needs extended time, not just because they have ADHD, but the testing shows they have a slow processing speed or something like that. It really does provide a basis. And one of the other things that I think is important for parents to know is that a lot of parents will get a diagnosis of ADHD, of bipolar disorder, or something else, and get frustrated that in and of itself is not getting them help or services at school. And it's very important that parents understand that a diagnosis of ADHD or any disability in and of itself does not guarantee you services. You have to show how your son or daughter's symptoms have a major impact on a major life activity. That is really the legal test. And if you show that substantial impact, you have to go a step further. I always encourage parents to understand their child's disability from a clinical standpoint, do research. But the most important thing that many parents overlook is really understanding it from their child's perspective. And as an adult with ADHD, part of my job is to really understand the frustration in that child's face and help the parents understand it so that they can effectively advocate. And I'm going to give you a story. This also touches on some of the research in terms of, or the practical strategies in terms of getting kids out there and getting them active. I was doing a workshop one night, and far too often school districts will deny or fight on services because they cost money. And I was doing this workshop, and I was explaining to the parents that let's see what accommodations we can think of that you think would be appropriate for your child that cost nothing or close to nothing. Let's try to take the word no away from the school district. And there was a mom in the back of the room who raised her hand and said, I'd like to share this with you. I noticed that my son played on the hockey team in school. And during hockey season, his grades were better. He was much more structured. I would get far less behavioral reports coming home from school. But at the end of hockey season, every year, his grades would tank and he would have difficulty. And I was sitting at a 504 meeting, and I was kind of scratching my head. And I said to the educators who were supposed to know, you give him gym twice a week. You think you could give him gym 4 times a week? And they all kind of looked at each other and said, okay, that sounds like a good idea. She said it made the world of difference for my son. And what's important about that story is not just that it worked out as a strategy to get something, but this was a mom who took the time to really understand what was going on with her son and what he was responding to in a practical way that educators could understand it. And in my practice, this is what I deal with every day. A lot of the issues that come up in my practice, in addition to just advocating for IEPs or more services, my particular area of expertise is because I have a law enforcement background. I do a lot of school discipline work, and also I'm one of a handful of attorneys in the country who represent students that get suspended at school and also get arrested for the same activity. And there's a lot more of that going on right now. And typically I find that impulsivity is really the behavioral culprit. These kids are smart, intelligent kids. They know the difference between right and wrong. More often than not, it's an inability to curb the impulse for what seems like it would be a good idea at the time, even if they know or are supposed to know that there are going to be consequences. And one of the other characteristics of ADHD is that it typically takes these students a lot longer, even with negative feedback, to appreciate the real consequences. When I was first diagnosed myself, as much as my wife tried to understand what was going on, I could see that frustration. I could see her saying, why can't you just do what you're supposed to? And it's very easy to fall into that. But what you don't see is behind our eyes, there is a lot of self-torture that's going on at wanting to do better in school. And that really, I also wanted to touch on one of the things that was borne out in the research is the co-occurrence and really symbiotic relationship between ADHD and anxiety. Sometimes there's an anxiety disorder as a co-occurring condition, but there's an enormous amount of anxiety that goes along with being ADHD. As an example, I can tell you when I was first diagnosed and I was taking stimulant medications, I've been taking them now for 20-something years. The doctor was asking me regularly, are you sleeping well? Are you sure you're getting enough sleep? And it was interesting to me because I was sleeping like a baby because I wasn't rolling around at night worrying about the things I wasn't getting done during the day. There is so much of a knot of anxiety with not being able to move forward. And as a consequence, a lot of these kids will seek high stimulation behavior as a means to compensate for something that is not working well in their bodies. Normally when I do a full presentation on this, I show slides of all of the disconnected wires and the neurotransmitters and the receptors for them. And if there's a breakdown in the system, there is a problem. And you know, a lot of these kids do this by flooding themselves with norepinephrine. These are the adrenaline junkies, the kids that are bored in class and just are starting out developing chaos because it's a means of forced prioritization. And that typically will translate to a huge problem behaviorally in school. The other thing I wanted to talk about from my perspective as an advocate for services is probably the most difficult student with ADHD to advocate for is the inattentive student. Not always, but a lot of times it's a female student. And the kid who's bouncing off the walls gets picked up immediately because the school wants to deal with it. The kid who's sitting at the back of the room staring out the window falls through the cracks all of the time. And if they're inherently intelligent, which every client I've ever represented is, they're coping somehow, but you know, they're getting B's or C's, and that's where the labels of underachiever, and that really wreaks havoc on their sense of self-esteem. And a lot of these kids will act out, and it gives rise to a lot of the behavioral issues we deal with. Interestingly enough, in the world of COVID, I've seen a significant decline in my suspension work because these kids aren't in the same room with each other. But what I am seeing is an increase in kids that are bored because of the lack of structure at home, and they're getting into trouble outside of school. A lot of desk appearance tickets by the police, a lot of family court cases for things that are kind of nonsensical because they're not in that structured environment. If you think of school in this way, parents laugh when I say this, but middle school, high school is probably the closest thing you'll find to a prison outside of the penal system. The bells ring, they march these kids around, you have to be here, it's highly structured, they get their time in the yard every day. It's just, when you kind of cut them loose in space, that is where we have the problem. And that is where I'm a firm believer that interventions like coaching could really make a huge difference in helping these kids develop structure, support, and accountability for themselves. The last thing I wanted to say was that parents often come to me and talk about arguing with the school to either get an IEP or a 504 plan. And once they get what they are going to be getting, or they have this fight with the school district, they think it's over. You really, as a parent, have to be constantly vigilant, because even if the IEP that you fought so hard for is appropriate, in 2 years, through your child's development, it may become less appropriate. Or what it says on paper is really not translating into what your child is getting in terms of services or support. Your child needs speech therapy. The speech therapist is out on maternity leave or transferred to another school, and we're interviewing new people. You have to constantly reevaluate. And now, given the virtual world that we live in through the world of COVID, students may not be responding in the same way to counseling through a virtual format or through organizational work. And one of the other things I will say about coaching, my experience has been, is that coaching has always been in a virtual format. So it's already geared towards that format for students who want to kind of develop this structure, support, and accountability on their own. And it can be enormously helpful, especially when they make the transition to post-secondary. I'm just looking at my notes. Oh, co-occurring conditions, that's the other issue. That's how I refer to it, as opposed to comorbidity. But typically the testing will bear that out. And in my experience, a child with, there's an old expression, ADHD rarely walks alone. And I think that when a child has ADHD and also dyslexia, dysgraphia, or something out like that, the testing will really help us focus on what is most prominent, what needs to be addressed most urgently, and where to really focus our resources in advocacy. That is all I have. Thank you so much, Candace, for giving me this forum to meet with these other experts and interact with parents. And if anyone has questions, I'd be happy to field them.
Thank you so much, Robert. I'm glad we got to do this, and I'm glad you joined